Not long ago, there was a vigorous nation with an imperial vocation that dominated the seas of the earth for centuries through the sword and commerce. It universalized its language, its culture, its political and economic system, and it left, for better or worse, a lasting influence on the forms that govern our current reality. United Kingdom of Great Britain, that small island that managed to plant its flag on a quarter of the globe. This kingdom especially remembers a monarch who shaped its character to the point that her name defines an entire historical era. The last queen of the House of Hanover, Queen Victoria Peregrino of the famous Victorian era, who, by avoiding the constraints of a constitutional monarchy, managed to influence the life of the British Empire, an empire that was beginning to emerge as the world's leading power. Join us to discover the fascinating story of this monarch, who left an indelible mark on the English collective imagination and beyond its borders. This is Rinaldo Carrillo with the new encyclopedia. Your support helps us continue this work, simply by leaving your comments, liking this video, and sharing the material with all your acquaintances. Below, you can also find a Patreon link where any support is more than welcome. Without further ado, let's get started. The birth of Victoria put an end to a long series of misfortunes in the British royal house in their quest to find a successor. King George III had lost the ability to rule, so his son, also named George, was the Prince Regent of the United Kingdom. However, neither the Prince Regent nor either of his two brothers was able to father the future successor because their wives had miscarriages or the babies died shortly after birth. Only one of the brothers, named Edward, Duke of Kent, was able to father a child. To Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a girl they named Alexandrina Victoria, who managed to come into this world. On May 24, 1819, Victoria was baptized at Kensington Palace by the Archbishop of Canterbury in the Anglican faith, the official state religion. The Kensington system, devised by her mother and supervised by the steward Sir John Conroy, governed Victoria's childhood with a strict approach that did not allow her to do activities she enjoyed, limiting her to only what her tutors instructed her to do. Conroy made sure that Victoria grew up isolated from her paternal family, following duties on inflexible schedules and sharing a room with her mother until adulthood, all with the purpose of saving young Victoria from palace intrigues, hallway rumors, and anything that could harm her. Psychologically speaking, the princess is described as a studious, quiet, and thoughtful child, with an extraordinary passion for culture, education, and the arts, all qualities that marked her personality during her reign. However, the harsh restrictions imposed by her mother and Sir Conroy also caused Victoria to develop a strong aversion to these two figures, to the point of describing her childhood as, quote, quite melancholic. She barely comes of age in 1837. She asks to be permanently separated from Sir Conroy, her mother, and the maids who accompanied her during her childhood and adolescence. Everyone knew that Victoria was no longer a child they could keep locked up in a palace. The young maiden, considered attractive in period paintings, was starting to feel and act independently. Her determined attitude showed in how seriously and quietly she accepted it. Quite surprising that she was next in the line of succession and that sooner or later she would be the Queen of the United Kingdom. When King George III finally dies, his son George, the Prince Regent, would officially become King George IV. However, he dies in 1827. As we said, since he couldn't leave any descendants, his brother William would become king in case William died, who also had no descendants. It would fall to his brother Edward, Victoria's father, to be the next king. However, Victoria's father had passed away years earlier. That's why, at his coronation, William issued an act stating Victoria would assume the throne after his death. Indeed, William IV died 10 years later in 1837, and Victoria is crowned as Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain on June 27th of that same year. As Queen, she appoints Lord Melbourne as her advisor, who was the Prime Minister from the Whig Party, that is, the liberal-leaning party in Great Britain. There were even rumors that the two of them were having an affair. However, her biographers describe it as a professional and even paternal relationship due to the young queen's inexperience in matters of state. Lord Melbourne lost influence when, in 1840, Victoria ended up marrying Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, with whom she was deeply in love. At the same time, she knew that because of Prince Albert's intelligence and qualities, he would be of great help to her in carrying out her duties. Albert proved to be a loyal husband, taking care of royal affairs during her frequent pregnancies, becoming her secretary. He also urged Victoria to forgive her mother for the difficult childhood she caused. By 1840, they had the first of their 9 children, Princess Victoria, affectionately called Little Vicky, and the future King Edward VII. Albert also once again shows his commitment by actively participating in raising his children. Returning to Victoria's reign, it's important to keep in mind that in the United Kingdom, constitutional monarchy had been the form of government since 1688, in which the monarch's power was limited. Sovereignty resided with the nation, and the people elected their representatives. This monarchical form would be described by Adolf Thier as, quote, a monarchy in which the king reigns but does not govern. In this sense, censitary suffrage was practiced, in which, through a legal census, the right to vote was reserved for men over 25 years old who were literate and had a certain amount of property. These men elected the representatives of the House of Commons, that is, the lower house of Parliament, which exercised political power, with functions including passing and repealing laws, as well as appointing or removing the head of the executive power, called the Prime Minister. In Victoria's era, politics was dominated by the two-party system of the Liberals, called Whigs, and the Conservatives, called Tories. Therefore, Queen Victoria, given the limited functions she had constitutionally, found ways to strongly influence the decisions of the current Prime Minister. Just as she had no qualms about supporting or rejecting measures from the Liberals, she also acknowledged or recognized the brilliance of the Conservatives. Both sides alternated between opposing and supporting her depending on the time period. Evidence of this was the so-called bedchamber dispute, with Prime Minister Robert Peel as the central figure. He replaced the ladies of the bedchamber at the royal palace with women aligned with the conservative sector of English politics. This was a measure that Victoria publicly opposed, which led many to question whether she was truly prepared to reign under a constitutional monarchy where the monarch is expected to remain above party struggles and refrain from expressing political opinions. Albert persuades the Queen to avoid compromising the image of the crown in 1842. Victoria is also the victim of an attempted regicide by a man named Edward Oxford, who tries to assassinate her with 2 gunshots when she was on her way to a protocol visit. The failed regicide results in a rise in the Queen's popularity. However, it would inspire other assassination attempts during her reign. A key aspect of the Victorian era is that its economy thrived during the peak of the Industrial Revolution. During this time, the construction of railways increased, and they went from transporting goods at 12 kilometers per hour in the mid-1820s to transporting goods at 80 kilometers per hour. Only 30 years later, 1,850 highways were inaugurated that connected the country from one end to the other. The telephone, machines, and the steamship appeared. With their great capacity, they would optimize the supply of raw materials to the booming cotton industry, resulting in increased productivity and unprecedented commercial exchange networks in the history of humanity with the rest of the world. It is the era of industrial capitalism, which produces rapid technological modernization and the creation of wealth, favored by the fiscal and budgetary balance of the state, which Victoria actively tries to safeguard. It is also the era of the expansion of the British Empire, which extracts more and more raw materials and resources from its colonies and other territories, sometimes by force, sometimes for manufactured or industrial goods. Despite all this, in the neighboring island of Ireland, the famine of 1847 breaks out, caused by agricultural and climatic factors, as well as the trade policy of the United Kingdom, resulting in the death of more than 1 million people. In Ireland, she was seen as an indifferent queen, inspiring only to the English, and was pejoratively called the Hunger Queen, or the Queen of Hunger. Even though there is evidence that she donated resources from her personal estate, being the main contributor according to the British Relief Association. She also supported repealing the grain laws, which raised food prices through regulations in the midst of the famine. Influenced by her husband, she also shows interest in European affairs, striving to improve relations with France, a country she will visit during the reign of Louis Philippe I of Orleans, becoming the first British monarch to visit France since King Henry VIII in 1520. An example of the relationship between the British monarch and her French counterpart is that when he was overthrown during the European liberal revolutions in the 1840s, Victoria would grant him asylum in Great Britain. With Germany, ties were also strengthened through the marriage in 1858 of Princess Vicky to Prince Frederick, Guillermo of Prussia, who a few years later would become the Kaiser of Germany. Interestingly, Alberto, Queen Victoria's husband, believed his daughter's liberal education would help Germany reform into a constitutional monarchy, an aspiration that failed partly because the regime's militaristic and autocratic nature left its territorial ambitions unfulfilled. As the saying of the time went, Russia was not a state with an army, but an army that created a state. The rest of Victoria's children would likewise marry various members of the European royal houses, which is why she would be nicknamed the Grandmother of Europe. These connections were a sign of Victoria's interest in forging lasting alliances with the different nations of the continent. In 1861, Victoria's mother died, causing her deep sorrow despite their distant relationship. However, her melancholy after this event was minimal, compared to what she suffered after the death of her husband Alberto from typhoid fever. In the same fateful year, Victoria, in a letter to her uncle, King Leopold of Belgium, would state, "My life is a happy person. It has ended, the world has." Depression is now Victoria's companion. She withdraws from public view, and even her doctors suspect she may have a mental illness. And during that difficult period, the influential Israeli Prime Minister appears in the Queen's life not only as an advisor, but also as a personal friend. Victoria will strongly support his government in foreign policy, which advocated for the expansion of British domains in Africa and Asia. The argument for Queen Victoria's support of British imperialism was based on her belief that the expansion of the United Kingdom was civilizing and beneficial, since, according to her, it protected native peoples from more aggressive powers or from harsh rulers, even declaring, quote, "It is not our custom to annex countries unless we are obliged or forced to do so," close quotes. Multiple scholars and facts have refuted these claims. Despite the enlightenment brought by the United Kingdom's expansion, it also led to the slaughter of native peoples, nor protection from the same cruel rulers at the same time that there was annexation of countries and territories. It can't be said that the United Kingdom was obligated or forced to do it, but the truth is the British Empire will also be able to count on it by 1900, along with the territories of India, Burma, Sri Lanka, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Uganda, Rhodesia, South Africa, Togo, Australia, the Solomon Islands, and many other dominions across the globe, such as in America and the Caribbean islands. It was the era of the expansion of capitalism and the relentless search for new markets, new territories, and new resources. An example of this is the famous Opium Wars, which led to a fierce conflict during the reign of Victoria between Great Britain and the Imperial Chinese dynasty. It was a war from which not only did Great Britain obtain the island of Hong Kong, but in which the British Crown used this narcotic on a massive scale as a weapon to subdue the Chinese population. By 1876, Victoria was crowned Empress of India, a country she never visited and about which she maintained a rather neutral position regarding the harsh conflict that the locals had with the British East India Company. In the final years of her life, the Queen would lose vitality, but nothing would diminish this decline in her ability to influence politics. In 1882, another armed attack against the Queen took place. She managed to escape unharmed and gained the solidarity of the English people in that bitter hour. The following year, her health suffered a serious setback when she fell down some stairs at Windsor Palace, causing her to have continuous rheumatism for the rest of her life. In 1887, the Golden Jubilee was celebrated, commemorating her 50th anniversary on the throne of the United Kingdom. Around this time, the Queen hired 2 Indian Muslims to be her servants. Among them, the young Abdul Karim stood out, who introduced the Queen to the Hindi language and Hindu philosophy. This, of course, caused special concern among the Queen's children and servants, who saw Abdul as a foreign element that did not belong in the Windsor Palace environment. The Queen, for her part, would ignore the reproaches of the royal household and keep Abdul's company until the final days of her life. Another key element of this era, beyond Queen Victoria herself, is that the Victorian capitalist phenomenon would have a great effect on the social fabric of the United Kingdom, producing, on one hand, a massive migration from the countryside to the cities, with the population increase from 11 million inhabitants in 1837 to 37 million inhabitants by 1901. By the end of the century, the English could travel easily, whether by trains, steamships, or even in the first automobiles. The English also took pride in their home life. The introduction of the radio, the gas stove, and electricity made daily life more comfortable for them. For much of that urban population, it was a time of 12 to 16-hour workdays, often with no days off. Workdays included child labor. What about the first crowds in proletarian ghettos? On the other hand, the move toward religious tolerance became a reality during Victoria's reign. Public worship of Catholicism is allowed, and churches are built for a religion that centuries earlier was fiercely persecuted by the Crown. This fact reflects the progressive spirit that characterized the Victorian era. There are significant educational changes, also through the requirement of compulsory primary education starting at the age of 5 and its public provision. Access to it was expanded. By 1900, it was estimated that 90% of British children between the ages of 5 and 10 attended school regularly. It was also a time of cultural energy. From the Victorian era, people often recall nights at theaters, museums, and reading clubs where they read Oscar Wilde, Charles Dickens, or Elizabeth Gaskell. Depending on the mood of the time, culture became increasingly accessible with newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph, which aimed to provide readers with a general overview of the world. The streets of London, Liverpool, and Glasgow are filled with important architectural works, with an eclectic style in which various styles such as Neo-Gothic and Neo-Greek are blended together to bring out the best of each. Victorian-era Englishmen were likely the most cosmopolitan people of their time. This is shown by the many archaeological, ethnographic, scientific, and cartographic studies the British conducted across their global possessions. From the excavations in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt to the search for self-realization in Eastern philosophy, the Englishman, who was raised under the crowned head of Queen Victoria, would maintain a cosmopolitan conduct and rhetoric befitting the great empire they possessed. By 1897, Queen Victoria celebrates her Diamond Jubilee, that is, the 60 years of her enthronement. That same year, she becomes the longest reigning monarch, surpassing her grandfather, King George III. This event was celebrated with an open-air mass around St. Paul's Cathedral, and with great demonstrations of affection from her subjects. The 20th century greets the octogenarian queen with a particularly melancholic mood, which she reflects in the passages of her diary. Melancholy, nostalgia, and daydreaming are quite common in the queen's final days. Not for nothing, following the death of her son, Alfredo, in July of that year. In 1900, she writes in her diary, open quotes, "This has been a horrible year. There is only sadness and horror everywhere," close quotes. The light of a substantial reign of almost 64 years eventually fades away. On January 22, 1901, on the Isle of Wight, where Victoria passes away at 81 years old, and with her, the Hanover dynasty has a simple funeral, as she expressed during her life. Victoria, who never trusted in the performance of women in public life, managed to overturn her own belief. With limited monarchical power, Victoria influenced her nation's unity and stability. Much from her era remains, though nuanced. English as a universal language, capitalism in a new phase, royal ceremony styles, and American imperialism, seen by some as a legacy of British imperialism. The extraordinary beauty that British culture achieved at that time, Buckingham as the royal residence, and, above all, the parliamentary monarchy, apart from the relevant historical judgments. Many agree that Victoria was a woman who understood the British idiosyncrasy, as rarely happened in the lives of other monarchs, who were generally foreignized by the dynastic variety from which their lineages came and by their constant protocol trips. Victoria, on the contrary, chose to be a monarch with a simple way of life. She lived outside the laws of the kingdom and taught the British people how a monarch should behave, how to be understood, appreciated, and what values could the people take from their queen for their daily lives. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget that it's very important for us that you subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, and share the video. Follow us on Instagram at La Nueva Enciclopedia, and please support us on Patreon in any way you can. Thank you all, and God bless you.